I was absolutely fascinated to hear you talk about Ted Hughes and his sort of example and his encouragement of you. But it seems to me that also extremely useful at that early stage in your career was your connection to a very, very different poet like Douglas Dunn.
Mm.
And
And
so I was
Philip
wondering
Larkin
in
as
what
well.
sort of ways you could say that the sort of contrasting examples of Larkin and Douglas Dunn also happen to be useful to you at that stage.
Well, yes, that's interesting because we talked earlier about tension and having Larkin as the librarian in Hull and Douglas Dunn as the poetry fellow, their poetics and Flynn's and Ian Gregson's at the time were very, very different from mine because I was forming this idea of, as you put it, the romantic isolate. There was that tension between that and realism, and Douglas Dunn at the time, as I remember it, was a communist. And my instincts were anti-materialistic, anti-communist. Well, not no, I was a socialist. Obviously, I've always been a socialist. But that sort of raw way of atheistic way of looking at the world just didn't appeal to me, especially as a young man. And so I felt on a limb. Um, but there were such huge figures. I remember Tony Flynn and I were cowering in a corner at the launch of Rumoured City, saying we didn't want to meet Philip. And Douglas Dunn coming up to us and saying, "You've got to meet him, he's God." because Larky was because Larky was deaf. What he'd done is remembered all 10 of us of our biographies, and he went round us in a circle, and we were all standing there trembling, because he was God. And he came to me and he said, "Yes," he said, "we had some success, didn't we?" Even though he wrote lousy things about me in his selected letters. But yeah, so that tension was there. Can I read Dawn now?
Before that, could you just say something about the sort of atmosphere in Hull in those days among the younger poets? Of course, Larkin and Douglas Dunn were established. I'm interested in this sort of period when, you know, you talk about you and Flynn living in each other's notebooks.
Yeah.
I'm interested in this sort of period where the whole poets were meeting and writing and sending poems out and influencing each other. If you could just say something about that dynamic before you read Dawn. Is that possible?
The, well, in those days, there weren't many poetry workshops about. I mean, Douglas Dunn's was a very rare example of a poetry workshop in 1974. They weren't widespread like they are now. So everybody really was on their own. So everybody had to fight their own corner.
Yes.
And I remember Douglas Dunn saying to Ian Gregson once, when he went to him for some advice and criticism, he said, "You're on your own now, Jimmy." you know, which made me feel even more isolated. You know? So I always had this feeling of being isolated. And then I moved to York, where I didn't have this support group of all these other lovely people, and ended up totally on my own. My marriage broke up; it was disastrous. Because all I wanted to do was, I felt more and more and more isolated. And I always have done. I don't know why, but it just happened.
Who would you say the main figures were for you then when you were writing? You know, obviously Tony Flynn, you mentioned Gregson. Did you
We,
come into much contact with Peter Didsbury and you said
well,
not so
well
much with Douglas Houston, but
Pete,
Didsbury and O'Brien, people like
Pete
that?
and I became very good friends.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. We didn't talk much about poetry actually, Didsbury and I. We just sort of got on well as human beings, I suppose. Because he's such a lovely man, isn't he? And but yeah, the contacts became less and less. There was Flynn, Didsbury, Douglas, who kept writing to me when I moved. Yeah, Douglas Dunn, yeah, and Hughes, of course, and then I started getting letters from people like Peter Redgrove, Roy Fisher, uh, all sorts of people, and then I met Pete Morgan in York, and that was useful when he was there because most of the time he had fellowships everywhere, and moving to Leeds actually was probably the next pointer, as it were, because then I discovered another community that I hadn't experienced since Hull. So I had 3 years in York at the university and so on, got married, tried to do all sorts of different things at once. And moving to Leeds was important because I met other people who were interested in poetry, like Dan Lyons, for example. And now it's this is where the first idea of the complete circle came round.
Yes.
With the setting up of the Flax Gallery. So it's the first time I felt part again of a poetic community since I left Hull.
Yes.
But, but, but actually, just to go back slightly to Hull again, the poet who always gets missed out in all the discussion of the Hull poets, I think, is George Kendrick. So I was wondering.
Well, he wrote to me constantly. George Kendrick wrote to me constantly, and he said he ended up by saying that I can't offer you any more advice, Tony. He said, because you have surpassed me. And I always admired his work, of course. I find that quite flattering and deflating at the same time. You know?
Tony, George Kendrick brought out just the one collection, didn't he? Bicycle, Tiring and Tall Trees.
That's right, yeah.
Can you remember who published that?
It was Carcanet Press.
Carcanet. Yeah. And he died, of course, you know.
And he died tragically. Well, he died of cancer.
That's right.
And
how do you rate him as a poet?
And I had this benefit reading for him on in a pub called the Bull, I think, on Beverley Road, and I was the only one who wasn't asked to read. Flynn read, and Ian Gregson read, and Evan Douglas read, and everybody read. But then I met Jean Hartley for the first time, and I just read her book on Larkin. Philip Larkin, the Marvel Press, and me. And I said to her, look, I've just read your book. It's fabulous. You know? And she was such a nice woman. And so it was a lovely evening anyway, even though I wasn't invited to read.
It seems to me that one of the great sort of disservices, you know, the Roman city does, I mean, it does a lot of good things, obviously, but the big thing that it did for me that was wrong was that it missed out George Kendrick, you know, because it didn't introduce him to a wider audience. Could you just say something about Kendrick's poetry? How did you feel about it?
He was such a self-effacing man that he didn't promote himself at all, and I liked his work immensely. It wasn't my kind of poetry, obviously, because in a sense it was not what I was doing, but he was such a supportive man.
He died.
It was almost a father figure.
He died leaving another collection almost ready for press, and Jules tells me that it's coming out.
Is it coming out?
Evidently, yeah.
Well,
No, that's interesting.
I don't know if I'd like that to happen, but actually it was mooted about 10 years ago and it hasn't happened yet. I'd like to actually.
Because he was a very meticulous poet, wasn't he? He was a lovely man, actually. but very humane. He'd actually he'd been in the armed forces, hadn't he?
Yes, I mean the point is that both in their sort of separate ways, Larkin and Douglas Dunn were rather for as personalities, they were either unapproachable or rather sort of abrasive. But George was extremely sort of approachable.
He was incredibly approachable. Well, he was a teacher, wasn't he? And he was a born teacher. He was a born teacher. Yeah.